Welcome, everyone. You are watching DirectLINE Live. It is February 19th, 2025. Almost at spring. Our guest tonight is former ACU chairman, the architect of CPAC, Washington Times editor-at-large, David Keene. And our hosts tonight are Mark Unkefer and David Shepard. Take it away, guys.
Well, thank you, David, for being on. Did you ever think CPAC would become what it has? CPAC was always big, but it's just taken off now. That it's the
first CPAC in the mid '70s was at the Mayflower Hotel in downtown Washington. Had about 125 attendees,
wow.
Two of which were a young couple that got married a little bit later, Dan Quayle and his fiancee Marilyn, and the featured speaker was Ronald Reagan, who spoke at 17 CPAC conferences in the years following as governor, as private citizen, as president of the United States. It grew steadily and over the years, and it's changed in its nature, as all things do. But it became vitally important first to the conservative movement itself, because it brought together all of the various streams of conservatism, the people that often didn't know each other, that worked on different issues, that may not have agreed on everything. But that one weekend a year, they got together and in the early days debated the issues. In fact, you can, if you go back through the records on some issues, most importantly perhaps is the abortion issue. Back in the 1960s, and early 1970s, most conservatives were what they would today call pro-choice. Ronald Reagan was, Barry Goldwater was, and most of those who attended CPAC were. You can actually follow debates at CPAC in the records over the years as that began to change. And of course, by the 1980s, most conservatives were pro-life. So they'd actually flipped on that. Back in the early days, the pro-life demonstrations were led by the likes of Jesse Jackson, and abortion was characterized as the South's final solution to the black problem. And by the 1980s, it was the liberal solution, abortion, to everybody's problems, I guess.
Yeah.
So you could see on that, on foreign policy, and some other things, the sort of shifts that have taken place over time within the conservative movement.
Yeah. Well, I must say that as a young conservative, CPAC was so important. So it was kind of like the opportunity for all of us to get together, to discuss the issues,
right,
to learn.
And that's still the case. Like at any conference, as you know, the real importance of the conference is not what takes place on the stage. It's what takes place in the hallways, where people get to meet and share ideas and experiences and bond. And particularly in the early days of CPAC, the conservative movement as a modern political movement was still relatively new and relatively small. And it was an opportunity, particularly once we began to focus on college kids. It became the one opportunity where they could get together with people that believed as they do, because many of these students for the rest of the year were isolated on campuses where they were mistreated as they are today, where their ideas were derided, and CPAC gave them a chance to discover that there were a lot of other people all over the country who believed the same things that they did and sought the same kinds of experiences that they were seeking. Yeah,
it was a wonderful time. And my first CPAC was at the Omni Shoreham Hotel. The Omni Shoreham.
Yep. Yeah, we had to keep moving because it kept getting bigger.
That's what I understand. That's why they apparently have to go now to the
Gaylord in Maryland.
It's the only thing that can house.
It's the only place big enough.
Right. Yes.
That's right. To handle it. Yeah, that's exactly right.
Your observations about
and it was it's since I've
go ahead.
I was going to say your observation about how this conservative movement
has changed sort of sets up a question or discussion about the way the Trump MAGA movement has changed the conservative movement. And obviously that's maybe a jumping ahead about talking about the first days of the administration.
I lost your. I lost your question. I'm sorry.
Well, so the question is what are your thoughts about the way in which the MAGA movement has changed the direction of the conservative movement?
Well, over the years, over maybe 35 years, as CPAC as an example, every year we would take a poll, give a questionnaire to the attendees. And the press would pay attention to it because they'd say, who do you think ought to be president? Who do you think? That wasn't why we did it. We did it internally to, there used to be talk about the three-legged stool of conservatism, the social conservatives, the traditional conservatives, the national defense conservatives, and the economic conservatives. And we found over the years that while the public issues being debated might change, sometimes it'd be national defense issues because of what was going on in the world, or social issues or the like, that in fact the makeup and the core beliefs of those attending didn't change very much over all those years. The most important group are the economic, free government, small government conservatives, and then the national defense and social conservatives come in at a lesser. But the secret to the success of conservatism was that when all of this began, they were all very separate. And actually, CPAC was a part of the effort to bring them together in what the late Frank Meyer, who was the book review editor of National Review in the 50s and 60s, and who was essentially the conscience of the early conservative movement, called fusionism. He used to say, you folks can argue, but you ought to argue in the basement of the White House rather than out here, because we have much more in common than we have in terms of differences. And it was the bringing of those various strands of what we today see as modern conservatism together that created a movement that was ultimately able to actually win national elections. Over time, every movement develops, and one of the things that's happened in recent years, there were really in all that time, the real changes in both the Republican Party and conservatism came about as the electorate began to change. Back in the 1960s, late 1970s, I should say, particularly in the Northeast and the Midwest, traditional Democrats, working class Democrats, began to move away from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party. It wasn't because the Republican Party was all that attractive to them. It was because the Democrats, particularly following the McGovern campaign, were so obnoxious that they couldn't stay there anymore. They moved first as a trickle and then as a flood into the Republican Party. And neither conservatives nor Republicans were very good at really adapting and getting their policies in line without giving up their principles, in line with the views of these new constituencies. That's still going on. Both parties today have sort of switched constituencies. When I was a kid growing up in the Midwest, if you wanted to get involved in Republican politics, you better know the manager or the president of the biggest business in town, the manufacturing company, the people that we used to call the country club parties. Then Goldwater came along, and all of a sudden you needed to know that the guy that owned the cleaner on the corner down on Main Street, because the party began to shift away from the really big business of the Northeast and the bankers to small business. It began to move west with Goldwater. And because of the emergence, particularly of social issues, those Democrats that were leaving the Democratic Party began to vote more reliably for Republican candidates and even for conservative candidates. That's continued. And one of the ironies today is that the leaders of both parties, and let's face it, most people get their view of the world and their take on things when they're young. Mm-hmm. So that if you listen to Democrats today, you'd think that they were the party of working Americans. In fact, most of them wouldn't have somebody from the lower classes anywhere near them in their gated communities, unless it was a servant or a house cleaner or the like. They have
That's very true.
nothing in common with these people. They don't like them. They're the ones who demonized and dissed them and don't understand them. If you listen to a lot of the Republican leaders, they sound like they're still representing Wall Street and the banks, and they don't, because the bankers don't want anything to do with them, and neither does Wall Street. So
David, as Governor Ehrlich always says, we're not the party of the Chamber of Commerce, and we're the party of NFIB. We're the party of the mom and pop restaurants.
That's right.
The small business that basically notice and I mean the party's changed. We're not
very much so.
I mean, we're not the party of college educated lawyers. Back in the 80s and 90s, we were known as the party of money and wealth and affluence.
Yep, that's exactly right.
For me, the biggest difference is the fact that Kamala Harris, the first time a Democrat, she did better with people who make $100,000 or more.
Of course.
It was just amazing to me that how it has reversed and flipped.
And both the leaders of both parties are trying to come to grips with that and trying to figure out how do we. The Democrats have done a better job of it. Too bad for them, because their new base is never going to be a majority. So, but they pretty much figured out how to talk to the people that they need to talk to. The problem is that they don't come anywhere near 50% of the population. The Republicans are still sort of scrambling, trying to figure out how to do that. So some of them, and you see this debate in Congress, you see it in a lot of ways on policy. Some of them are saying, well, we need to appeal to those voters the way the Democrats did. And what we need to do is change our principles. Others of them I think more honestly, and ultimately will be more effective, are saying, how do we take our values and merge them with their values and come up with something that is saleable to them, allows us to represent them, and gives them a seat at the table. One of the reasons that Trump succeeded in 2016 was, as I've said, we accepted those votes, Republicans did, but didn't do much to keep them. So they kept voting Republican because the Democrats, to their chagrin, kept becoming more obnoxious every year. So they said, well, we can't go back to those guys. But now who's listening to us? Who's doing anything? And pretty soon they came to the conclusion that neither party was really doing that. And the guy that spotted that was Trump. And he gave voice to what they wanted. And part of it was that they wanted to be respected. They wanted to be heard. They wanted somebody they could identify with. And he was that guy. So what you've got now going on is really conservatives and Republicans sort of in a dark room wearing sunglasses, trying to figure out, how do we put all this together? It's going to take some years to do that. Trump thinks he's got the answer. Other people think they've got the answer. And it's going to work its way out. But I would predict that when it's over, the conservative values that provided the foundations for the growth of the movement in the first instance are going to be the same foundation that we build upon going forward.
I mean, as I tell people, we're still the party of tax cuts, family values, national security. We are the party of new ideas and better ideas. The Democrats haven't had a new idea since the New Deal. Because if you look at it, because I remember growing up, every good Republican was ready to dismantle FDR's program. I remember in the 80s, I was about 8 years old when President Reagan got elected in 1980. And I remember my granddad said once, he goes, he's going to dismantle FDR's abominations programs, that he had. And unfortunately, we're still stuck with the biggest FDR program, Social Security and Medicare, Medicaid.
Well, but yeah, of course, that's a combination of FDR and Lyndon Johnson building on what the New Deal was. And and the irony is that that neither Johnson nor FDR would be at home in the new Democratic Party for other reasons. But we still, and what we have is something that was built at a time when there were real problems, and that I won't say they've outlived their usefulness, but they've not adjusted to reality, and so the reason that they set 65 as the retirement age under Social Security was they wanted to get older workers out of the workforce, because back then there was an unemployment problem. So they said, let's just pay them off, retire them, and also the actuarially, you didn't live much longer than 65 back then.
Yeah.
Now you live till you're 90. You know.
Yeah, that's right.
I really think the retirement age, we need to bump it up to 72. I'm willing to compromise and do 69, 70.
Well, they're going to have to. What's going to have to happen, because the fact of the matter is, and in a way, I look at what's going on, or what's been going on since the election, and it's sort of the return of the Tea Party. Because the last time we had any discussion of real discussion of government spending, the national debt, the cliff that we were approaching, and the need for spending cuts was during the Tea Party movement some years back. And neither party has done much about that until now. It's interesting because this last week in the security conferences that are being held in Europe, where Trump is demanding that they need to spend more on their own defense, the EU has rules, too many rules for most of the people that live there. But one of the rules goes to the deficit spending question, and that they, in order to spend more on defense, they have to free the cap that they have on how much a government can spend, and that cap now is around 2 or 3% of GNP goes to taxes and spending, because it's feared that once you get beyond that, you're in trouble. You know what the percentage of the U.S. GNP that goes to taxes? 6.3%. So yeah, and yet until Elon Musk came along and teamed up with Donald Trump, there was literally no discussion of the sort of crisis that everyone will quietly acknowledge is ahead. So you had American politicians just kicking the can down the road and saying, when it collapses, I'll be dead. But now they're at a point where when it collapses, some of them might be in wheelchairs, but they won't be dead.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. I mean, we're getting to the point where I tell you, if the one thing Doge does, if they can only do a couple of agencies, they should start at HHS, USDA, and education, and if they can, State Department. That's where a lot of the pork has been residing. And HHS, I've seen at HHS, when I go in there, civil servants sitting there playing solitaire on their computers or shopping on Amazon or on Facebook.
Well, I remember years ago when Elizabeth Dole was appointed as the Secretary of Labor. A reporter asked her husband, who was then Senate Majority Leader Bob Dole, said, "How many people work there?" He said, "Oh, about a third of them." I think he was being optimistic about that, because in some of these agencies, not a lot gets done, and government is the worst in terms of efficiency because there's no accountability, and as a result, it isn't a secret. It doesn't even require bad people. It just requires human beings acting in their own interest to say, well, I don't have to work to get that paycheck. I don't even have to go to work anymore to get it. And so you get a guy like Trump, who his one advantage this time over last time is now he knows what's out there. He didn't. He can't. He sort of was the innocent in town in 2017. Now he knows that you can get mugged if you don't know what you're doing, and so he's made plans. He's gotten a team together, but the pairing that's so important is his pairing with Musk. I mean, Musk may well be, in all practical ways, the smartest guy in the world. And his desire is not just to cut spending; it's to reinvent the government and to bring it into the 21st century. That's a tough thing to try to do, but at least they're trying. And in the process, they're going to save money saving money, firing 5% of the workforce and all of that sort of thing is not going to solve the problem, but it's going to set the stage for solving the problem. And partly because Musk is a guy who thinks completely outside the box, and Trump is a guy who doesn't mind breaking the furniture. They have an opportunity to do things that others couldn't do, regardless of their intentions. When Dwight Eisenhower became president, his first order to the cabinet was, we need to cut 10% of the workforce and 10% of the spending. Failed. Ronald Reagan came in with the same thing. They failed. They're surrounded by bureaucrats. They're surrounded by, what the current generation calls the swamp. And eventually they just realize it's not going to happen. These guys, for two reasons. One, because apparently when he was in exile, Donald Trump must have read Saul Alinsky, because Alinsky had told the left wing, you throw everything at them and they can't defend. They'll run around with like chickens with their heads cut off because they won't know what to do. And that's what he's doing. He's throwing so much at them that they can't decide what to go after. I mean, and when they do decide, it turns out to be something they shouldn't have touched with a 10-foot pole.
And I mean, look how he picked his cabinet. He threw Matt Gaetz out there knowing well the media was going to eat him up alive. And then, look, we got Pete Hegseth, who they said would never get through. Kash Patel's about to get pushed through. We've got, Tulsi Gabbard in. RFK is the one that I'm thinking, like, the Democrats really should be ashamed of themselves, because they were tripping over this noise about RFK when Obama was president, and it's just insane, how these Democrats, they really don't have a loyal bone in their bodies, frankly.
Well, remember when during the Biden and Obama administration, they were so proud of the fact that these billionaires like Zuckerberg and Bezos and all of them were for them, that the billionaires were good until a bad billionaire came along, and then all of a sudden billionaires were bad.
Billionaires are changing their tunes too.
That's right. So I really have more hope now than I had on election day, because there are a lot of pitfalls ahead. One of the problems that any president faces, and Trump perhaps more than others, is, and it's one of the reasons why in a two-party system it keeps shifting back and forth, is that you have a race in which the challenger says the incumbent screwed everything up. You've got all these problems, and he wasn't able to solve them, so you ought to try me. So the public says, okay, we'll try you. 4 years later, you've got the same problems. They haven't solved most of them. And then the other party comes back and said, well, he had his chance, and he didn't solve it, so now you ought to try us. And the electorate swings back, and presidents tend to assume when they're elected. This isn't just presidents. This, if you run for the city council, you probably assume the same thing. But they assume that they were elected to do everything they wanted to do, and that's usually not the case. So they get. You remember Bill and Hillary Clinton tried to force through a healthcare system we called it Clinton Care back then, because Bill Clinton said he had a mandate to do it. It had been one sentence in one paragraph in one speech during the campaign, and he said, "Well, I got elected to do this." No, you didn't. And so now, and this is true of Trump as well. I promised to do this. Yeah, you promised to do it for 1 minute in a 3-hour speech somewhere. And it may be a good thing to do, and you should keep your promises, but don't fool yourself into thinking that the public wants you to do everything that you want to do. That's a natural problem for presidents. It's one of the reasons that the first 2 years are so important, because in Trump's case, if he doesn't come to grips, particularly with inflation, he's in trouble. In the off year. Fortunately, he has the one thing going for him that every Republican has, and that's the Democratic Party, which will continue to be obnoxious enough and tone deaf enough not to even realize where their opportunities lie.
And I think if the Democrats keep And I don't want them ever to listen to James Carville because this way they will be in the wilderness for about 12 years, I think. I think we'll get, and that's, and that's if they wake up somewhere in those 12 years that, like, hey, we should not be nominating Walter Mondales and Mike Dukakis's,
Right.
Well,
and
well, I've said the same thing. Remember, they lost 3 state presidential elections.
yeah,
They lost in 84, then 88. No, yeah,
Yep.
80,
80.
80, 40. Well, it didn't take, it had to lose the 3 elections before they moved to the center with Clinton. And I think it's going to be the same thing. I think they're going to hang on to the wokeness as long as they can, the sort of the sympathetic, open type borders. I think they'll hold on to it as long as they can, but eventually they're going to get tired of losing. But I don't see it turning around quickly.
Well, what happens?
Also,
What happens with a party that loses, as they've done this time, is that, and the reason it takes so long is that once the party goes into the minority, particularly in the way the Democrats have now, they didn't lose by a lot, but they lost all 3, the White House, the House, and the Senate, and most of the governorships. What then happens is that the party is more and more beholden to what's left, which means the ideological fringe. I actually, years ago, Donna Brazile, when she was Democratic chairman, asked me about that, and I said that's what's happened with both parties. Fortunately for the Republicans, their base has more in common with the average voter than does the base of the Democratic Party. But they are dropping down to be dependent upon you're now in a situation where AOC is a moderate within the congressional caucus of the Democrats, and that isn't because she's become a moderate; it's because the moderates are gone. And so for some years, it's going to take some years for them to realize that they've got to change their act or lose forever. They'll realize that time will come. The Republicans will screw up. You were talking about Bob Ehrlich before in Maryland. I came to town years ago during the Nixon years to work for Ted Agnew when he was vice president, or governor. And then we had Hogan and Ehrlich and the like. Those guys were elected because the Democrats before them screwed up so badly that anybody could have been elected. And then it was in each case it became impossible to hold on to it after that experience. But now the Democratic Party nationally is at the point where they've got to hope the Republican Party screws up, or it'll be very hard for them to crawl back because they don't have the leadership, they don't have the policies, and they don't have the trust of the average American.
And with the DNC, with their new leadership, there's already infighting. David Hoggs took the donor list and started raising money for his own PAC. As vice chair, that's the first thing he does is. The
idea that you would appoint or elect a one-note lunatic like David Hogg to be the vice chairman of your party says more than I could ever say about the Democratic Party.
Bits and pieces of their convention. I'm thinking, are these people for real? This one woman goes, "I'm the black transgender, whatever." Like, I don't think are you guys for real? I thought you guys just say that in public.
Oh no, they're for real.
Oh yeah, they're insane. And I've got some friends of mine that are like sort of, I call them in-place defectors with the Democrats. They hear everything, they relay it back to me about all the crazy stuff they're doing.
Well, one of the reasons I think that in recent election cycles, both parties, and this is a great change in America over the years, partly technological, but it's for a variety of reasons that we have segregated by ideology. And one of the reasons that Republicans think Democrats are stealing elections and vice versa is that a lot of people in either party have never met anyone that voted for the other party. So if you live in Manhattan and Donald Trump is elected, you say, I don't know how that happened. I've never met anybody that voted for him. So they must have stolen it.
We have that in Montgomery County too.
David, that reminds me of the old joke. I forgot who it was who said it, but I think she was serious. I think it was a New York Times reporter that was convinced in '84 that Walter Mondale would win because she said she never met a Republican. So how could Mondale
right.
lose?
Yeah. And you know this.
I told Mondale, who was a nice guy,
Yeah.
who loved to fish and smoke cigars, that if he were honest enough to be pictured smoking a cigar and fishing, he'd have a better chance.
Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you, he's another one that probably would not be welcomed in today's Democrat Party.
He might. He was pretty liberal.
Well, you know who?
But I tell you know who I
Bill
think
Clinton.
would, who I'm kind of like Pat Moynihan. I always thought he was a liberal for New York, a senator from New York. But today,
he was intellectually, he was not a liberal. Voting wise, and one of his people he had mentored told me at the time he was running for the Senate, never trust Daniel Patrick Moynihan, because he'll do all of these analysis which says A, but if he gets elected, he's going to vote B because all of his friends are there and he wants to take care of them. And that's exactly, if you look at his critique and his intellectual positions, they were very solid. His voting record was as liberal as anybody you could find.
Yep.
Well, you know, I still get back to the amazement in my lifetime of Bill Clinton, because think about it. We thought he was a raging lefty at the time. But with Clinton, you got a somewhat balanced budget. You got welfare reform. You got the.
Well, that's all because of Newt Gingrich. I think he had to play ball with.
My point is, all these things. You got the crime bill. All these things today would be an abomination to Democrats.
Hey, David, that was the Joe Biden crime bill. If you Joe Biden gets
but Biden distanced himself from that. Clinton, I don't think did. But
that's right.
And welfare reform. So.
Yep.
And reinventing government. Remember, he wanted to reinvent government.
He cut the size of he furloughed people.
They did all of the things in a very, very small way that the Trump people are doing today. You know, the big difference today really is Elon Musk and technology. I mean, they're so upset because what he's doing is following the money, and you couldn't do that. You had politicians talking about transparency. Nobody believed in transparency. My God, if you knew who originated all the earmarks in Congress, there'd be fewer congressmen. And if you knew who was shoveling money to whom, there'd be fewer people in the federal government. So the transparency was something that everyone talked about and no one really believed in. And what Musk has done is just simply, is just following the checks, because he said people can say whatever they want, but the money talks, and the money trail is always there, and that's basically all he's doing.
But I liked his idea this morning. He was floating $5,000 dividends for every single American that pays taxes. I like that idea.
I saw that.
It's about time I get some of my money back.
Well, he's a brilliant guy, and it's good to have someone who's outside of Washington looking at Washington, someone who is a disruptor, someone who reorganizes businesses. And I like his point that you can't save a lot of these industries. You just have to rip them up and start anew.
Right. You can't and in the business world, painful as it may be, that's what happens.
Yeah, that's right.
A company that's 200 years old, like our government, would have to have been ripped up several times and reassembled to deal with the modern world, and our government hasn't been ripped up in that way. That's painful for a lot of people, but companies trying to survive that can't print money have to go through this all the time and figure smarter and more efficient ways of doing things. The federal government doesn't have to do that, never has, and it sure as heck doesn't want to.
And I know we used to do that at ACU, Dave. We'd staff up for CPAC, and then after CPAC,
right?
A lot of people would go. Like campaigns are the same way.
That's what parties used to do.
Yeah. And now, it's like a permanent, and it's only on the right side of the aisle of the nonprofit world. Like ACU and CPAC are both 501c4s. We do that. While AARP and the left, they always seem to keep their people around. Revolving door between their NGO, their favorite NGO, and the federal government. They go back and forth, kind of like the way the trade-offs the North Carolina governor and senator used to trade off for years. Or actually, it was the president of NC State and governor. Or Senate. They would trade off back and forth.
Well, that's probably what USAID and to some degree the Department of Education is. They're handing out the grant money, so they're helping fund NGOs.
Well, look where they come from. USAID was actually an executive order by John F. Kennedy at the depths of the Cold War, and there was some reason for it at that time.
Yeah.
But from day one, it became sort of a good old boys network where you can make money internally or externally. The money was being shoveled out for reasons we now know made no sense in anybody's world. The Department of Education was Jimmy Carter's payment to the teachers' unions for the work that they did for him. So these were both political, not governmental, agencies that had a real purpose. The purpose was exactly what we found out that they're doing, and that is shoveling money out to their friends. And they've been doing it for decades, and it really needs to stop. Has education gotten better because of the Department of Education? No, it's gotten worse. Even though we spend more money on it than we ever have, and for purposes that make no sense in many cases, and AID. I remember back when Reagan was elected, and John Bolton, who was at the White House with Jim Baker, finally left and went over and was general counsel to AID. And when that ended, his desire was to be head of AID to destroy it, because he said it needs to be wiped out. And Jesse Helms said, if that's what you want to do, I can make that happen. But under the circumstances, there are other things that you should be doing. But anybody who's been there knows what it is. And it's just a way to feather your nest and to feather the people who are going to feather your nest for you after you get out.
Yeah. No, I definitely think that shouldn't survive. I wrote a column last week where I told the story of I grew up in McLean, and pretty much all my neighbors, my dad was probably the only one that didn't work for the federal government. And one night, a friend of mine we'd heard had gotten a job at USAID. I didn't know anything about government agencies or government programs or anything, but I just remember my father, I was a little kid, railing to my mother about what a waste of his money, his tax money, USAID was.
Oh, yeah.
And I just remember that story. And it's even worse than my father would have dreamed, because I don't think my father would have ever dreamed that they were involved in.
Well, that's the amazing thing about what's going on now, is that it's being discovered and revealed that most of these operations are worse than their severest critics believed they were. And that's actually got the Democrats in quite a quandary. Because take AID, for example, their base, the money people, the people at the NGOs, the people that really provide their policy support and all that, most of them are probably feeding at that trough as well as several others. And they're demanding that something be done. But you notice they're a little leery about getting out there and deciding that's the hill they want to die on.
That's right.
Because there may be something. There's a great fear in Washington that Trump and Musk are holding back things, and some of these that are even worse than what's been made public. And so if you get too far out on that limb, the limb's liable to get cut off on you, and that's not going to bode well for your political.
And I tell you, there are, I'll be the first one to say there are some government agencies that actually do good work and are reasonably efficient. But I could probably count them on one hand of those agencies that are good. NASA is one of them. NOAA's good. NIST is good. NIH is the biggest bloat there is. You think
I don't know, back when Ronald Reagan wanted to get rid of the Department of Commerce, somebody asked Bob Dole, does that include the Weather Bureau? And he said, well, they're wrong half the time anyway. But the fact is that if you take Health and Human Services and the Pentagon, and if you were able to go after both of them in a way to eliminate what goes on everywhere, you'd be a long way towards solving the problem, because neither one of them has. I mean, the Pentagon has never been able to pass an audit, because they don't know what happens to the money. And now it turns out that Social Security system spends money without even logging where it's going, to the tune of trillions of dollars. This is something that if you were running a small business, you'd end up in jail. If you had stockholders in that, because of these people are not fulfilling their fiduciary responsibilities to the people that fund them, that being the taxpayer, and they need to be cleaned out. There's something. The only problem that you get with this, and the Democrats are searching for this kind of thing, is that when you go in with an axe, you're liable to have some innocent victims. I mean, there have already been cases. You fired Joe, and you find out actually Joe was the guy that was running things and knew what he was doing. You hire him back. I mean, the whole. If you've read much about Musk's business practices, he'd go in and fire everybody, and then backtrack it and hire 10% of them back. That once he figured out who was worthwhile and who wasn't. And in the political world, that's akin to saying when he said, "Well, we'll make mistakes, but we'll fix them." Politicians don't say that, because politicians, of course, we all know, don't make mistakes. So, but I think the public finds that refreshing. And I think that if they show some results on that score, the public likes that. They're entertained by it. They know there's a real problem out there. But they're also saying that the price of my groceries hasn't gone down. So they've got to run two tracks. One is to remake things, and the other is to solve real world problems that consumers face every day.
Yeah, and I think grocery prices, I have noticed some prices are coming down. If you look at I've noticed potatoes are down a couple of pennies. Since Biden administration. I mean, of course, we're in the winter months right now, so we're getting potatoes from South America. I think we get domestically grown potatoes come spring, and more coming online as the warmer climates. I think we'll see. I think around July, August, we'll start seeing basically at the grocery stores, we'll see.
Well, that's how long he has on some of these things. I mean, I think he's showing more direct consequences on immigration, because the people trying to cross the border are drying up because of the cost of doing it up to them. So I noticed today that a coyote now wants $30,000 rather than $5,000 or $10,000 to smuggle you across the border, which means that more of our people are doing their job. I think that's visible. And the other thing that needs to be visible is inflation, and he's got to get his tax program through. So there are real big things out there. Yeah. But the fact of the matter is that what he's doing on this other side that we've been talking about is very important, not just because it plays well in the news, but because the future of the U.S. government and the future sustainability of providing needed services as opposed to just wasting money is at stake, because we are headed for the fiscal cliff. We're now paying more for interest on the national debt than we're paying for defense.
Yeah.
And
we're kind of like basically seeing that bright light at the end of the tunnel, so to speak, where it comes with looks like, and there's no more tracks after the tunnel.
What was John McCain's line? He says, "Yeah, there's light at the end of the tunnel. The problem is it's another train coming at you."
Yeah, after his retirement from the Defense Department, a friend of mine in Chicago was having lunch with Don Rumsfeld, and it was a 2-hour lunch, and it went on. They're talking about problems in the Middle East, the challenge of China, all of the things that you would be talking about. And then at the conclusion, he said, "Well, Don, what is the greatest national security threat that the United States faces?" And he said, Rumsfeld actually just sat there for a minute thinking, and then he just looked at him and he said, "The national debt."
Wow.
And he said, the day is going to come when we aren't going to be able to defend ourselves because all of our money is going to interest on the national debt, and we aren't going to be able to provide services to our citizens. And when that time comes, we're in real trouble, and that time is fast approaching.
Very true. And we are at time now, David. Thank you for being on the show. We'd love to have you again very soon. But as we like to do, we like to plug our friend at Missoni's restaurant in Perry Hall, Maryland. If you guys ever get out there, Dave, you have to stop in there. The restaurant is owned by Greg and Chris Missoni, his daughter, and Greg is the comms guy. Greg and Chris were both comms for Bob Earl.
Uh-huh.
And it's a great little restaurant, great food, great people, great atmosphere. I know they've done debate night. They did election night watch parties there and all sorts of fun stuff. But I like to plug them. They're good people. And
Good people that make good food are hard to find.
Yeah. And Dave, you got a book out, right? How's your book doing?
Well, I'm sorry.
Dave,
I'm sorry. Go ahead. I cut you off. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, mine's not out. I'm working on one.
Okay. We'd love to have a book party for you once your book's out, though. Definitely.
But what about yours?
Dave?
Well, I wrote 2 fictional they're novels. It's fiction, takes place in Virginia. I wanted to capture the pre-Youngkin leftward drift of Virginia. I did it through my own characters, and I tell the story, which is fiction, but all sort of happens. So you may recognize the people.
Okay,
So it's Elections Have Consequences, a cautionary tale. And I just wrote a book, which is probably more like a novella because it's under 200 pages, called Norton's Choice. He's the governor of Virginia. He's got to make a choice to stay in office or resign. His party wants him gone for political reasons. I thought it was a better way to give my opinions and to do it through a novel. I could just make up the characters, but you can see all the points. The characters are archetypes.
The best political novel about Virginia was written by a liberal by the name of Garrett Epps years ago.
Yeah, I have a book. Mine was the conservative version of the Shad
treatment. Shad treatment. Okay, and that's a great novel, and it was thinly veiled. So
well, read mine. Mine's even more naked. The thinly veiled is a nice way to say. So.
But I'll tell you something. You're to be congratulated. Fiction is harder than nonfiction.
I agree.
Yeah,
but I think it's truer in some ways.
Yeah, and actually, writing a book is just it's basically a long-term. I've been working on a textbook for candidates to run for office. I've got everything together. It's just putting it together just takes so much time. Right now, I've got it in digital format on Republican Toolbox. I've got everything in there from sample direct mail letters, how to do this. Like basically, it's basically like my experience when I ran for House of Delegates in '94 when I was 21 years old. And it was a good experience. I liked it. It's a good book. But it's just getting it all together just takes so much time.
It's a lot of work.
Yeah.
But and when you and Don are feeling up to it, we'll go over to Missoni's one day.
Oh, it's a deal.
Yeah. Cool. Well, good night, everyone. We'll see everyone next week. Take care.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you. Bye.